Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today. We're just going to give everyone just a couple minutes to log on, and then we'll get started. Hello, if you're just joining, we're just going to give everyone just one more minute, and then we'll get started. All right, I think we can get started. I think most people have joined. Hello, everyone. Thanks again for joining. My name is Jennifer Ellis, and I am a Senior Director of our Market Access and Analytics team, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. So before we get started, I just want to note that we do have the chat and Q&A function. So if you want to ask any questions at all, please feel free to type them in, and we'll get to them as soon as we have a little break between sessions. So today, our topic is Prescription Drug Affordability Boards, the potential impact on patients. So first, we'll start with quick introductions of our speakers today. Rachel and Becky, Rachel, actually, would you like to get started with the introduction?
Sure. Thanks, Jennifer. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining. My name is Rachel Bessie, and I'm a Director of Reimbursement and Health Policy on the Magnolia Market Access team. And I've been in the market access and health policy consulting space for about 5 years now. Becky?
Hi, everyone. I'm Becky Roman. I'm a Senior Director of Market Access and Value Insights with Magnolia Market Access. I've been a market access consultant for just the past year, but I've been a managed care pharmacist for over 20 years.
Great. Thanks, Becky. I think we can go ahead and jump onto the next slide. You want to go back one? Perfect. Thanks. Thanks again, everybody, for attending and jumping on. We're really excited to be talking about this topic with you all. View of Prescription Drug Affordability Boards, or PDABs, and then go through a general sort of PDAB process flow that PDABs go through when they're conducting affordability reviews. Then Becky will go through a few examples of some drug reviews that states have conducted over the past few years. We'll talk about some potential impacts on stakeholders across the healthcare landscape, and then leave you with a few considerations from an awareness and action item perspective. So with that, we can jump in to an overview of PDABs. Thank you. So typically a PDAB will consist of anywhere from about 5 to 9 individuals who have some sort of expertise or experience in medicine, healthcare economics, pharmacology, or relevant fields. And oftentimes PDABs are supported by an advisory council of other stakeholders, such as patients or providers, who can offer some additional perspective to the PDAB as they are going through their decision-making process. And from a high level, the goal of a PDAB is to lower drug costs and limit spending for patients in the state. And there are a few different ways that a PDAB can do this. Broadly, they can recommend certain policy measures to lower drug spending, but in some cases, PDABs may conduct affordability reviews of certain high-cost, high-spend drugs in the state, and when they have the authority to do so, may establish upper payment limits, or UPLs, to cap drug costs for drugs that are deemed unaffordable to patients in the health system in that particular state. Now, in the cases where a PDAB is able to establish an upper payment limit, those UPLs may apply to all consumers of state-regulated plans, or in some cases, just certain cohorts, for example, Medicaid. In some states, certain self-funded plans may also be able to use the UPL if they wish. Next slide. Thanks. So the influence of PDABs and PDAB legislation has certainly grown over the last several years. We can see here on this map that there are currently 11 states with established PDABs and another 7 that are actively considering legislation to establish PDABs in this current session. I'll also note, interestingly, that in Arizona during a past legislative session, there was a piece of legislation that ultimately failed that was seeking to establish a PDAB. But again, it failed. But in this current legislative session, there is legislation that is in effect skipping over the PDAB process and jumping straight to the upper payment limit setting process by applying the maximum fair price, or MFP, that is negotiated during the drug price negotiation program to drugs in the state for any individual or entity purchasing it in the state. So, of course, significant potential for that to not only broaden the scope of individuals to whom the MFP could apply, but also could potentially serve as somewhat of inspiration for other states who may be looking to meet a similar end goal with perhaps less labor-intensive process. So certainly something to watch as we make our way through this legislative session. Next slide. Perfect. So let's go ahead and jump into the PDAB process flow. Now, again, as I mentioned, the process for PDABs depends on the state. It's different based on the state and what they've written into statute and determined via regulation. So this is sort of a high-level overview of the process, and there are nuances for every state. But typically, the process includes 4 to 5 steps, depending on whether or not the PDAB has the authority to set an upper payment limit. The first step in this process, however, is identifying drugs that are eligible for an affordability review. And while the eligibility criteria may vary based on the state, typically states are looking at pricing data to determine whether or not a drug meets a certain wholesale acquisition cost, or WAC. They may be looking at price increases of a certain dollar amount or certain percentage over a given time period. Many state PDABs are looking at brand name drugs and biologics. However, they may also consider biosimilars and generics if the biosimilars and generics are less than a certain % off of the reference price, for example, or exceed a certain dollar amount off of the reference. And similar to the drug price negotiation program, some PDABs may also consider the drug's length of time on the market, in some cases for greater than 7 years, for example. I'll also note here that some state PDABs will also build in exceptions that make drugs ineligible for affordability review. For example, some may consider a drug ineligible if it's the sole treatment for a rare disease or something like that. Next slide. Thanks. So once the cohort of eligible drugs has been identified, the PDAB will go through the selection process to identify which drugs from that cohort will be subject to an affordability review. And again, the criteria depends on the state. But in this step, we see a bit more of the patient impact piece being considered. For example, out-of-pocket costs that patients may have for the drug, or what utilization will look like in the state. They may also consider health plan impacts, total plan spend, or average per prescription. I'll speak about this a little bit more on the next slide, but the PDAB may also consider therapeutic alternatives for the selected drugs or generic availability. And in this step, the the PDAB may also consider more stakeholder input, relying, as I mentioned, on that advisory council for any insights that help paint the picture a bit more on that patient impact and accessibility piece. Now, Becky will speak a little bit more on limitations in a bit, but I think it's worth noting for this step and the previous step in the identification and selection process, PDABs are often not seeing the full picture from a data perspective of a drug's cost. They're often just seeing the list price of the drug and not able to take into account rebates, financial assistance, or patient assistance that the manufacturer may be offering. From more of a formulary perspective, they may not be seeing the utilization management requirements of patients that could impact their affordability and accessibility of the drugs. So because of this sort of incomplete data picture, the state PDABs may be identifying drugs and selecting drugs for affordability review that may be inappropriate and down the line have some accessibility issues for patients. Next slide. Thanks. So as I mentioned, the PDAB will consider therapeutic alternatives for the selected drug before they conduct the affordability review. The PDAB may give this process to their advisory council or other support staff, or it may be kind of conducted amongst them. But really what they're trying to glean is to look at the selected drug and its cost versus comparisons and their respective costs, as well as to identify whether or not the selected drug may fulfill a specific unmet need for the patient population in that state. Again, the process by which therapeutic alternatives are identified is variable. It depends on the state. In some states, it may be more narrow, and they're looking at therapeutic alternatives within the same pharmacologic class, whereas in other states, it may be wide and may include any treatment option for the specific disease. Again, it just depends on the state. Next slide. And with all of this information collected and the drugs selected for affordability reviews, the PDAB will actually conduct the affordability review. And they may conduct the affordability review taking into account any of the following factors. Certain cost analyses looking at the drug's WAC, discounts that may be provided. Again, the patient access and health equity piece in some states may be considered as well if there are financial burdens that patients go through when accessing these drugs, or if there are barriers that impact their ability to remain adherent to treatment. The PDAB may consider different market dynamics, looking at the availability of the selected drug versus therapeutic alternatives, and again, what the pricing looks like relative to the selected product. And again, stakeholder input in this step is important as well, not only from the advisory council, but from different advocates, patients, providers, and public comments where appropriate as well. Next slide. Thanks. As I mentioned, not every state has the authority to set an upper payment limit, but for those who do, the fifth and final step in this process is to establish an upper payment limit for drugs that have been deemed unaffordable to the health system and to patients in the state. I want to clarify that a UPL does not affect what a manufacturer can charge for the drug in that state. Rather, it's impacting what a pharmacy or a provider will pay for the drug in that state, or how much the plan may reimburse for that drug. Now, again, approaches may differ depending on the state. Some states may establish like a limitation on the number of UPLs that can be set during a year. Others may not. There may be differences in how a state PDAB will arrive at a UPL. For example, some states may align where appropriate the UPL to the Medicare MFP, whereas others may benchmark this to the price or the UPL in another state, or the price of a drug in a similarly situated country like Canada. Some PDABs may build in exceptions for UPLs. For example, if the drug ends up on the FDA's shortage list, it might not apply. And as I mentioned earlier, with respect to UPLs, they may apply broadly across any consumer in a state regulated plan, or they may just apply to certain cohorts within state regulated plans, such as Medicaid enrollees, for example. Next slide. Now, as I mentioned, not every state has UPL setting authority. At this point in time, only 4 states have the authority to set a UPL, though Oregon's PDAB was tasked with developing a methodology to establish UPLs prior to being granted the authority to do so. We can see here that a couple of states, Colorado and Maryland, have started to go through the process of identifying drugs for review, actually conducting the affordability reviews, and in the case of Colorado, landing on some drugs that they deem to be unaffordable and able to be subject to a UPL. However, I want to emphasize that no PDABs to date have established a UPL thus far, which I think speaks not only to some of the limitations that I described in the previous process, but also to the challenges associated with actually operationalizing a UPL. So with that, I will turn it over to Becky to discuss some of those limitations.
Sure. Before we get started, Jennifer, I can see if there's any questions that have come through for the first part.
Yes, we actually do have a couple of questions. The first one is, you mentioned some criteria to identify eligible drugs, such as meeting a specific WAC amount or meeting an annual price increase of a certain amount. How do states decide on which criteria to use? And are states following the path of the first state adopters?
Yeah, I can jump in with that one. So the criteria that the PDABs are using are typically laid out in the statute establishing the PDAB or in regulation that the state has established after the fact. So those are previously established. I think it's certainly possible that the PDABs are looking to already established PDABs for inspiration of what criteria to use. I think there are also certain bodies like NASHP, which Becky can hopefully spell out that acronym for me. It's not coming off the tip of my tongue, but other bodies that can sort of give example criteria, resources, things like that to help establish those criteria.
Great, thank you. The next question we have is, how are the members of the PDABs elected and how long is their term?
Yep, good question. So the members of the PDABs are typically appointed by the governor in the state. Their terms will last a few years, typically like in the range of 3 to 4, and they usually are able to be reappointed to the board after that term that they serve.
Great, thank you for that. And the last question we have here, are the affordability review factors such as cost analysis, patient access, et cetera, are they weighted in a certain way, and are states placing more emphasis in some areas than others?
Yeah, sure. I can take that one. So there's a lot of, as I think was described through the process part, there are a lot of different factors that are being considered and weighed, and that sometimes is laid out either in the statute even, or sometimes in just the regulations that have followed. But there isn't really a prescriptive formula that the reviewers have to follow in terms of you weight this, this much, and you weight this component in a certain way. So it is variable. I think that also on the plus side allows for some variability in terms of the type of product and condition that's being reviewed as well. But no, there's not really any specific weighting that goes on. Clearly, when they're tasked with looking at affordability, pricing is going to be extremely important, but they are also tasked with looking at the clinical data as well.
Great, thank you, Becky. We actually had one more question come in. So this person joined a little bit late, but can you go back and describe what lives do the UPLs, PDABs impact or govern? Is it Medicaid, state commercial lives, et cetera?
Yep, that it depends on the state. as we've reiterated over and over. But yeah, every state has a different process. It'll look differently, but in some states it'll just be Medicaid. In other states it'll be any consumer of or a individual who has coverage through a state regulated plan. Just depends. It's up to the state. So thank you for your question.
Yes, and some states will allow self-insured plans to opt in as well. So there's that, potential as well. Okay.
Jennifer, I think you're muted.
Oh, sorry. I actually had another question come in. Thanks everyone for jumping in with these questions. Has any state PDAB considered or adopted a biosimilars first policy?
No, it's an interesting question. Not that I have seen yet at this point in time. A lot of the states are still pretty early in their review process, but as you can see with some of the drugs that have been selected, particularly in Colorado, some of them, one of them has a biosimilar on the market, which we'll actually talk about in here in a little bit.
Thanks, Becky. That's all I have for now.
Okay. Thank you. All right, well, we'll get into our next section here, which is just talking about some of the concerns and limitations associated with these processes. So in 2024, the National Academy for State Health Policy, so NASHP, in partnership with Portal, which is the Program on Regulation, Therapeutics, and Law, they developed this toolkit of resources to assist states with implementing PDABs. And the toolkit offers a lot of information and considerations for states as they work through and establish their processes for affordability reviews, as well as setting upper payment limits. So we'll talk through again some of these concerns and limitations to highlight both some of the options that are provided with the toolkit, as well as with how states are operationalizing these processes. So first concern to talk through is just a broad drug selection and aggregation. So as was mentioned earlier, while the statute generally details the key criteria for selection, there is a need for states to determine how drugs will be identified in databases and grouped together for the purposes of the affordability review. And states can take a variety of approaches here. Some are, very specific to drug strength and formulation, so such as using like the NDC. Others can be a lot more broad, such as grouping at the active moiety level. And active moiety is a term that talks about like the drug molecule or biologic molecule that is responsible for the physiologic or pharmacologic action. So if you're grouping at that highest level there, states really run the risk of treating drugs that have different brand names and indications, different formulations or methods of delivery or administration. The risk is that they could all be viewed as the same, and it could overlook or not recognize these really clinically important differences in having different treatment options available. The second point is that, or concern is that states are considering potentially multiple perspectives in their review. So PDABs are, as we mentioned earlier, established to really lower the cost of prescription drugs. However, many are trying to consider the perspective of multiple stakeholders, such as the state, the healthcare system overall, and the patient when they're conducting their reviews. And really understanding what perspective you're looking through is critical to determining what type of data is required and how that analysis will be conducted. The third thing is regarding how therapeutic alternatives are identified. So one common approach that's suggested by NASHP and Portal is the use of clinical practice guidelines to identify and select these therapeutic alternatives. And there's several concerns about taking that approach, including first and foremost that clinical guidelines are not written for that purpose. That's not their intent. They're developed to help summarize evidence that's out there and provide recommendations to practicing providers regarding use and sequencing of different therapeutic options. Other concerns are that states have to determine which guidelines to consider. So there can be multiple out there from different organizations. So that can lead to there being some variability in the recommendations that are out there. And then, of course, there can be variability with how that PDAB will interpret those guidelines. There is a concern, of course, with potential bias of the authors of those publications. And importantly, how current is the evidence and recommendations within those papers? You know, typically new to market drugs are missing. So sometimes the recommendations are that PDABs can supplement guidelines with ongoing studies or other references to kind of fill that gap. We move to the right side. Generally, PDABs are combining the clinical assessment of a product with the value or economic assessment. And this contrasts very sharply with how payers typically approach coverage determination and formulary and utilization management development. So it's probably most are aware payers generally have a pharmacy and therapeutics committee that first makes a clinical determination of the product compared to its alternatives before they decide if any differences in cost are justified, and that is conducted through their business or value committee evaluations. So combining these reviews really has the potential to overweight cost and budgetary impacts over the clinical value of the product. It also has the potential to not give the type of consideration that there should be for looking at direct and indirect costs, but also savings that could be achieved. Next concern is regarding limited consultation with key stakeholders. So as mentioned earlier, PDAB members typically have clinical backgrounds. And while they may consider input from stakeholders or their counsel, and that can include practicing providers, there may be a lack or insufficient engagement with the specific clinical experts. So really specialists should be consulted throughout the process, including during the drug selection, the identification of therapeutic alternatives, and importantly, during the affordability review and UPL setting process. And then finally, Rachel kind of talked through some of the different available methodologies for setting UPLs. She mentioned there's numerous options under consideration using like reference pricing as an example, whether that be the internal reference pricing, looking at therapeutic alternative pricing, or external reference pricing, looking at Medicare, MFP, or Department of Veterans Affairs, or even international. But just want to again highlight this point that regardless of the methodology that's used, one of the key concerns is that the states don't have the complete data that are required to make this affordability determination. They don't have access to the product net price or the net price of the therapeutic alternatives that they're looking at. And if they're considering the patient perspective, the state PDAB may not have access to benefit design information or have a holistic view of the actual patient out-of-pocket costs. So, and in addition, as we mentioned before, there are a lot of concerns and unknowns about how a UPL will be implemented when one is set. So we wanted to help illustrate how state PDABs are approaching the drug review process. So we'll walk through two different examples. So first, the state of Colorado reviewed Stelara in June of 2024. So Stelara was approved in 2009, and just as some background, it is classified as an interleukin 12 and 23 antagonist. It's indicated for adult and pediatric plaque psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis, as well as adult Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. It is a self-administered subcutaneous injection for all of those indications, but there is a one-time intravenous loading dose in the inflammatory bowel space. Of note, the biosimilars have launched at the beginning of this year. So after they had conducted the review in June, we had biosimilars that launched this year. So following the statutory criteria, Colorado maintains an eligible drug dashboard, currently has over 600 products. And Stelara was one of 5 drugs that were selected from that database or dashboard. And that was based on 3 major factors that they highlighted in their report. WAC price increases being greater than inflation, that the majority of their health plan carriers reported that it increases premiums for covered lives, and that it was also included in other state assessments. So they, to the point earlier, they are looking at other states through this process. For the next step, Colorado used a fairly robust process to identify therapeutic alternatives, considering all its indicated uses. But there was one key limitation, and that was that some of the alternatives were just too new to the market, so they didn't have cost and utilization data available. Despite the board kind of discussing that Stelara is an effective and valuable medication with a good safety profile, they felt that the average out-of-pocket costs were high and they were increasing year over year, and that rebates may be high, but savings were not being passed on to consumers. Of note, the following week, the board reviewed one of the therapeutic alternatives to Stelara, Cosentyx, and also found it to be unaffordable. And then while not listed as a therapeutic alternative during this review, there are some overlapping indications of Stelara and Enbrel, and Enbrel earlier was found to be unaffordable. So as was mentioned earlier, Colorado does have the authority to set UPLs. However, Stelara's UPL has not been set yet. The board is in the process. They are using its rulemaking process to make a determination regarding UPLs for the 3 drugs that they found unaffordable in 24. They will start with Enbrel, and that will begin in April, and they plan to hold at least 3 rulemaking hearings, which will go into July. After Enbrel, then Stelara or Cosentyx will go through the process next. So that's our first example. We'll go to our second example, which is the state of Oregon. So they are required to review at least one insulin product each year. So Humulin R U500 KwikPen was one of the products that was identified and selected. And if you're not familiar with this product, it is a concentrated regular insulin. It's indicated for adults and pediatric patients who require more than 200 units of insulin per day. Other regular insulin preparations that are out there are available as 100 units per ml. Humulin U500 is 500 units per ml. And the KwikPen is an insulin delivery device that is a pre-filled pen. In the middle, you can see the therapeutic alternatives that were identified included the vial preparation of the U500, as well as less concentrated forms in vial and pen. Plus, they also included the 70-30 insulin, which is a fixed ratio of longer acting insulin and regular insulin. So the board determined that the Humulin U500 KwikPen may create affordability challenges for healthcare systems or high out-of-pocket costs for patients. The board indicated the cost of the product was high. Interestingly, if you look at the review materials, the cost and utilization data that they provided indicated that only about 550 patients were utilizing the product in the state, with over about 3,500 claims. And then the average out-of-pocket cost was around $165 per year. There was no evidence that the board deliberated the clinical utility of the Humulin R U500 for patients that require these large daily doses of insulin. And they also did not comment or make comment to consider the ease of use of the pen administration, particularly for patients that may have visual or dexterity impairments, or the value that the product brings potentially for patient safety compared to its alternative in the vial formulation. So to close out Oregon, they currently, as was mentioned before, do not have the authority to set a UPL. However, they were required by law to submit a plan to their legislature, which was completed in December. So with the intention of PDABs being to lower prescription drug costs, there could be these unintended consequences and impacts to patients and other stakeholders as a result of their actions, specifically with setting upper payment limits. So we'll start with manufacturers. It is possible that depending on the UPL and how it will be applied, that there could ultimately be a decision to withdraw the product for sale in the impacted state. There could be other significant impacts to different pricing arrangements. For example, selling a drug at a low UPL or having the reimbursement set in one state with a very low UPL may reset that best price for manufacturers with Medicaid. So that could kind of change the picture there. There's also the potential for double dipping with 340B discounts if the UPL is implemented on the reimbursement side. And this could be a concern just with the limited oversight with the 340B program. Setting UPLs on products could also provide a disincentive to manufacturers to continue research on additional clinical uses or new formulations, especially if the PDAB is selecting the drug very broadly, like we mentioned earlier, at that active moiety level. Moving to the right, it is possible that pharmacies could be reimbursed at rates below their acquisition costs if the UPL is set too low. And since it's still unclear how any UPLs that get set will be implemented, it's just unknown how pharmacy dispensing fees and the pharmacy resulting margin will be factored in. But if pharmacies are going to be upside down on UPL set drugs, or they have to rely on some sort of retroactive payment, to make them whole, pharmacies may choose to not stock these products. And we're seeing this already happen with the Medicare maximum fair price products. There was a January survey from the National Community Pharmacists Association, and they found that nearly 1/3 of independent pharmacists decided to not stock one or more MFP drugs. Now, for those who do stock, and since not all plans, may be subject to the UPL within that state, there is the potential for, increased administrative burden and operational challenges within the pharmacy to ensure that they're, charging the right price. If we move to the bottom left, drugs with UPLs may lead to changes in benefit design and formulary and utilization management by payers. Payers may want to promote use of the product with the UPL, right? Like requiring patients to step through it for other products. Payers may also want to promote other rebated products within the class and move the drug with the UPL to a non-preferred tier or increase all of these different things, it could lead to increased complexities for contracting, both with pharmacies and manufacturers. And this, of course, also results on additional administrative burden to the stakeholder group too. Also, the potential of decreased access to certain products for their patient population could end up increasing overall cost of care for payers. And then finally, for providers. So providers that are administering medications with the UPL have the potential for reduced reimbursement, especially if PDABs do not consider other costs beyond, the drug cost itself. And those are costs such as, procuring the medication, storing it, administering it. So this, along with, reduced innovation, decreased pharmacy access, it could all lead to less therapeutic options available for the treatment of their patients. And providers will also experience administrative burden if, potentially payer plan design changes and they have to go through additional medical necessity or prior authorization requests. So many of the impacts that we have discussed really ultimately influence patient care and access. Reduced reimbursement for pharmacies or providers can lead to reduced access to medications with the UPL. And if that's the optimal treatment for the patient, this can result in worse clinical outcomes and increases in other healthcare costs. Just want to point out and emphasize that PDABs are not mandating any change to plan benefit design, which of course determines coverage, formulary, and what a patient's cost sharing responsibilities are. So plans are not required to lower the tier or cover the UPL product. However, a UPL could influence plan design changes, as I mentioned earlier, which could of course lead to access barriers to either the med with the UPL or those other treatment alternatives. In addition, while we don't have it listed specifically on this slide, manufacturers may consider changing or stopping patient assistance programs to compensate for lost revenue, which could increase those out-of-pocket costs to patients. In the bottom left, unlike with formulary or processes at a payer, if a UPL results in a complete loss of access, there are no solutions like prior authorization, medical necessity, requests or appeals to make the medication available. And then finally, as we mentioned previously, UPLs do have that potential to decrease innovation as companies reassess how they invest in new therapies or biosimilars. So obviously deterring biosimilars kind of significantly negates the efforts of PDABs, as many high-cost products are biologics, and biosimilars have the potential to significantly reduce costs for the state and patients. So as we discussed, all stakeholders in the pharmaceutical supply chain could be impacted by the activity of PDABs, particularly UPL setting. However, there are some specific groups that we identified that could play a major role in increasing awareness and creating this call to action. I will start with the provider associations. They, of course, can play a big role in educating their membership through state or even national level campaigns, and in really encouraging engagement through comments, both in writing and at PDAB meetings, regarding the entire process from selection to setting the UPL. Manufacturers, of course, can assist with creating awareness for their key stakeholders, both patients and providers. Manufacturers can closely monitor state-level PDAB activity and, of course, contribute as well to deliberation in writing and or verbally. And then finally, some patient advocacy groups have really already been quite involved as they have recognized the significant impact that these unintended consequences could have on patient access and treatment options. So continuing educational efforts and then also helping to support patients and their caregivers to participate in the PDAB process will be critical to ensure that their voices are heard by the board. So I'll stop there and see if there's any additional questions that we can address.
There are a couple questions here. The first one is, what is the optimal way to identify therapeutic alternatives?
Yeah, I think that's going to be a challenging one for sure, to figure out what's the best way. Certainly, looking at within a, particularly a pharmacologic grouping of medications, understanding where they are matched for indications, meaning, they have that supported data and efficacy, is certainly the first, place to start with all of this. Clinical practice guidelines can be informative to kind of more helping, I feel shape the affordability review, understanding the place in therapy and impact. But really looking at kind of the entire class as a whole, based on pharmacologic action and FDA approved indications, I think is really the optimal first step.
Great. Another question we have here, since pharmacies have the potential to be significantly impacted, resulting in not stocking medications with UPLs, what actions are they taking or should they take?
Yeah, so definitely they're a key stakeholder group that could have definitely been included on that last slide. And pharmacy, some of the pharmacy groups are very actively also involved in this and tracking this and highlighting some of these key concerns. But so I do think, continuing to advocate for their important role in this whole process. They're often a key point of contact for patients and helping to assure that they, obtain their medication, obviously, and then also, have the optimal outcomes with them. So I think, yes, the same sort of approaches need to happen with pharmacists actively engaging with the PDAB and continuing to track all of this activity.
Thank you. So we also have another question here. Which of the 7 states with pending PDAB legislation are likely to pass in 2025?
Good question. Tracy, do you have any thoughts there? I know you've been looking closely at PDAB legislation.
Yeah, so I think that for now it's still up in the air. There is still considerable interest, as there is interest in other price setting legislation. So unfortunately for now, I don't think I can have a really good sign on my crystal ball. I think that what we've seen is based on what's been proposed in the past, and then what continues to reappear is that if it doesn't pass this year, they're likely to bring back something next year. So not exactly a concrete answer, but I think that this is not a topic that goes away.
Yes, thank you, Tracy. And also we have a question, how do you foresee PDABs affecting PBM formulary decisions?
Yeah, so I think there, just to again reiterate, I think it'll depend a lot on the payer and the type of perspective that they're taking in this. Some payers may, as I mentioned earlier, want to advocate, use of the drug with the UPL because that may align with their goals. Others may, want to steer more towards other types of products within that class that maybe are not subject to the UPL, where they have a little bit more negotiation ability. So I think it'll be variable, and a lot will probably depend too on how these UPLs, are slated for implementation to really understand all of those other impacts.
I would just add that we're seeing a similar question come up with the maximum fair price, right? And so while Part D plans will have to cover the MFP drug, we don't yet know if states are going to require coverage of UPL drug. And if they do, will they require it to be preferred? And at that point, that takes a considerable amount of decision-making and negotiation ability, quite honestly, away from the PBMs. And if you can't negotiate a rebate on a drug that has a UPL, if you're just somebody at some point on the chain is buying it at a lower price, how enticing is that for the PBM, and what does it do to the therapeutic competitors? I think we just don't know. But there's a lot of unknown, and the states probably, as they move forward, will decide a lot of that, but then so will the PBMs and the pharmacies and the providers, as Becky and Rachel have mentioned.
Thanks, Tracy. And another question here, do you expect that eventually all states will have a PDAB established? Could this become a federal mandate? Why or why not?
I would say I do not expect all states to operationalize or even enact PDABs. These are inherently not easily implemented. First, it's not easy to identify the drugs or the therapeutic alternatives or the price, and then getting the plans to fall in line, we just talked about. I think this is the next couple of years version of importation, where everybody talks about it, and maybe there's a lot of legislation, and then you don't hear about it because people move on to something that they think will be that next big new thing, which might be tying to MFP prices like Arizona's doing. So there's always that next step of what can they do to lower prices. Tying to the MFP is probably a lot more predictable and a lot less work. And so maybe that's the next big thing, or maybe it's something else. I think PDABs fade out over the next couple of years.
Interesting. Thank you, Tracy. Looks like that's all the questions we have right now. So thank you everyone so much for joining today's call. We would really love for you to attend our next webinar on Thursday, April 24th at the same time from noon to 1 p.m. Eastern. The topic will be an overview of real-world data in vaccine safety, and you'll be hearing from our health economics and outcomes research team. So thank you again, everyone, and we hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day.